much for having me. My name is Kimi, and I work in many genres, but I'm going to mostly talk today about writing. How many of you are writers? Great. So you will be familiar with this, this concept. Maybe you're familiar with this exact sentence. But writing is easy. All you do is stare at a blank sheet of paper until drops of blood form on your forehead. So I find the concept of muse interesting. I don't know that I subscribed to it at the time that I was asked to come here, but the more I've thought about it, the more I realize that having things to depend on or call upon while the blood's forming at your forehead is really helpful. So I'm going to talk today mostly about my process as a writer and what inspires me. And while I do that, I'm going to kind of also talk about my book, which you should all buy. That's how writers make their living, barely. I have to sell a lot of copies before I get my advance back. So anyway, you can get it at Antigone or anywhere you buy your books. I'll be plugging it often. So how to write a novel is what I'm really going to talk about. And I came up with like 5 muses or things that have inspired my process. And so the book, The Lightest Object in the Universe, came out in July. It's my debut novel. I started writing it in 2005. So it was a very long process, and it took me just a little over a decade, and then the whole publishing process was another, 3 or 4 years. When I think about muse, I think about what one writer told me very early on in the process. He's like, I don't think it's so much about muse as it is about assitude. You have to have a good assitude, which means you have to get your ass in the chair and keep it there. So there are things that inspire us, but it's like staying power. You have to stay with it. And you all know that as creative people. It was just, nothing was more true for this project because it took so long. So when I started writing the book, we were having conversations about peak oil. Do some of you remember those conversations? And so I was really concerned that, we were kind of living this in this unsustainable reality that continues, not funny. But we also were at war with Iraq. And so I was really troubled, and I was writing nonfiction about this predicament, this personal sense of struggle I was having with growing up in the superpower and having the privilege of that superpower, which is what we used to call the United States. Some people still do. But understanding also that the way that this country got its power was sometimes on the backs of other countries. And I had spent a lot of time in Latin America, and I'd seen kind of the reach of economic and cultural imperialism and some of the challenges with that, and we were at war, and so I was struggling. My writing life looked like this. And I decided to give that conundrum over to fictional characters and see how they might fare with some of the questions I was grappling with. So while the apocalypse is a really crappy scenario, my story is a love story, and I really wanted to have a different tack. I felt like most post-apocalyptic fiction and film gave you things that look like this, and I just wondered, what if we were powered by love, and what if we were nice to each other instead of just living in scarcity and fear and cruelty. So people have been asking me where that hope comes from, and how is it that I could imagine a post-apocalyptic, a hopeful post-apocalyptic story. And the book really is grounded in this premise, this necessity for community. And where that came from is from Tucson, and from having lived here for the past 22 years and being an artist in a very collaborative community, which you all know because you are part of it. And observing the way my neighbors have treated each other, and being in a community of artists, and this reciprocity and collaboration. And so my first muse is really this notion of community that runs through the novel. There's a character on the East Coast named Carson, and he's a high school principal. And there's a character on the West Coast named Beatrix, and she's a fair trade activist. And they've met before the thing goes down, before the grid collapses, and they've started a romance. And so the book is really about Carson's journey west toward Beatrix, and then Beatrix's journey to rebuild her neighborhood after the collapse. So she really they both draw on this, on sort of understanding and figuring out what trust is and learning how to rely on other people, which is kind of we know that that's what the United States is supposedly about, but I think we forget because we are powered by rugged individualism, but there really is this spirit of community that we can tap into. And so for me, that community comes from my neighborhoods, it comes from artists I know, it also comes from the Sonoran Desert. And so I really those of you that know my other work, I really have broadened my definition of community to include our friends, the saguaro cactus, and I hang out with them, and who what are the other plants and animal species that are part of our community and that are our neighbors. And then, of course, just the support that any artist needs when they're doing a big project. And this was my my launch night at EXO, and my whole community came out for it, and it was just this magical night, and I really felt the support that I'd offered people, and then the support that I have received. And EXO told me that it was the biggest crowd they've ever had, even for any musician that has ever played there, for literature. So, yes, we do read. So community. And then the second muse is this idea of superheroes. So within any community there are superheroes, right? And how do we find those? And so my book, one of the things that inspired my book was very literally one day in my neighborhood that I lived in on the west side at the time, this group of cyclists came through wearing capes. They called themselves the superheroes, and they go around the country, I don't know if they're still around, and they do good deeds for people. And they ended up going to my neighbor's backyard, and they built a compost toilet in one afternoon. And I was like, that is just the coolest thing ever. So my book has, it has the People's Bicycle Brigade, and it's good deed doers on bikes. They're kind of like the internet on wheels, and they help Beatrix, sort of in this community building, and they help people fix their bikes, and they help people learn how to trade. So the superheroes are really important. My other superheroes in the writing of this book are activists, and this beautiful young woman wasn't around yet when I started writing the book, but the conviction of young people who are fighting for their causes was really important for the character of Beatrix. And as we age, we can understand the nuance in issues, but I do think some of that diehard conviction is really important when you're fighting for a cause. So the character of Beatrix is really inspired by activists that I know in Tucson and activists around the world, mostly people at that time working on anti-globalization causes, but now climate activists are my heroes. And so the other hero in the book is this character named the Red Raven. And one of the things that Beatrix does to bring her community together is she uses a radio drama story to try to use the power of fiction to teach people how to connect with each other. And the superhero of that radio drama is a Red Raven. And she's countering this evangelist who's luring people to the center of the country, who's taken over the airwaves. And so she's using the power of story to connect people. So the second muse is superheroes. The third muse is our animal allies. How much time do I have left?
You're already halfway through.
Okay, good. I'll slow down a little bit. So this is Jasmine, and she was my dog for the first part of the writing of this book. She has since passed, but those of us that have pets know that having an animal at your side or at your feet is just a really incredible part of the creative process. They remind us that life is in the moment, that when things get frustrating, you can just take a walk. So for me, like I have 2 new dogs now, who I've had for a while. And so I feel like the animals have been a really important part of my artistic life. Animals also play an important role in the book, particularly birds. So I mentioned my neighborhood on the west side. When I started writing the book, I had a chicken coop and raised chickens. Kind of like that had been a long time generational practice in that neighborhood, and now, of course, everybody does it. But the chicken time was really important, to just go out and spend time with the hens. And then the chickens in the book, of course, become a way for people to eat and survive. So this tending and care of small livestock after the apocalypse is a skill that could come in handy. And then the birds, there are birds that run through the book. I mentioned the red raven, but also I feel like, so Carson, one of my characters, he's a bird watcher. And so he's on his journey, he looks for birds. And birds, to me, represent a kind of a lightness, aloft. Hope is the thing with feathers, Emily Dickinson tells us. So I wanted to infuse that like lightness and hopefulness in the book. But also birds are fragile. And, if we think of the canary in the coal mine, birds are vulnerable. And in the book, the birds also portend danger and violence. So the 4th muse is improvisation, or play a different instrument. So as creative people, some of us work in many genres. I feel like it's also really important for my creative process to have like another activity I do that, in this case, like that wasn't just working on the book. I mean, I had many, but one of the main ones for me was this practice of compositional improvisation, which it's a movement form that I did with other dancers and musicians, and we get into a studio space or outside and we make something up ephemerally on the spot. And I've been practicing that form for over a decade. And it was a really beautiful complement to the novel writing. And so when I say like side practice, like some of you run, some of you ride your bike, some of you do triathlons, like to have your other practice that you're also doing, because there are crossovers. There are things we can learn from the other practice, whether it's an art form or not, that I think can really sustain like a primary project. So for me, it was the improvisation, and one of the things that it continuously reminded me was that this is all an experiment. So for me, like writing can be, like when I was starting, like it could be sometimes precious, like you put words on a page and then they are there for eternity, but like, I don't know, maybe this character, needs to be expressed in first person. Maybe this character needs to be expressed in third person. And so rather than getting precious about it, I would remember that this is a lab and I could try different things. And it sounds crazy because I know as our creative people, we're trying things all the time, but like we can get really wedded, especially when we're like, I gotta finish this thing. And so the ephemeral practice of improvisation and using my body was just a really good counter to that kind of mental process of getting things down. And just to remember that like it's a lab. Like we don't have to take it so seriously. It's poof, gone. So being improvisational was really important to me. And then the last muse is the train tracks. So those of you who live in Tucson know that the train can interrupt our creative process at any moment. So my character Carson, unlike Beatrix, who's very much of a feisty activist working to change the world, Carson is more of the observer. He's trained as a historian. He probably would have been a journalist if he didn't go into teaching high school. And so he leaves the city, and because like when the thing falls, he knows it's just going to get more and more dangerous. So he leaves the city and takes off walking, and the railroad is the way he walks across the country. So this journey that takes place along the tracks, for me, this was started off very literally, because I would ride my bike through the city here, and oftentimes I would be interrupted by the train, and I'd stop and I'd watch the train go by and observe the amazing graffiti. There's also some graffiti scenes in the book. But this idea of this track that keeps moving forward. And so as I was asking those questions, reflecting about the process, reflecting about like, what if the world ends? How will we survive? I started paying attention to the tracks, and like one day this character started walking down the tracks, and I followed him, and that was Carson. And I think that this idea of staying power, I mean, he walks for thousands of miles. He does get a ride at some point. But as artists, we know that staying power is so much a part of getting the thing done. And so on his way, he observes the way people are connecting with community. He observes the birds. His side practice, if he has one, is probably writing letters to Beatrix, because this love is also what's sustaining him. And he just has this like forward propulsion, which any novel always needs. And he led me, actually, he taught me like how to keep going and to persevere all the way, towards the end of the book. So those are my 5 muses. They are what helped me in many ways complete this book. And you can find the book on Amazon, IndieBound, Antigone Books. You can get it directly from the publisher, Algonquin. And I hope you read it and tell me what you think about it, and share with me what it inspires in you. Thank you so much.